Welcome to this week's episode of ClearTalk. Today, we're going to be talking about vocabulary. I'm very happy to have Brad Malone and Joel Harris with me from Navigate. Bradley, do you want to start us off and answer the question, why is vocabulary important?
Well, I've been teaching, been an instructor for years. And what I find, especially in this industry, is that every word has a meaning, and that meaning conveys information and decision. And what I find is that when people are either lazy in their language or internally inconsistent, we're not sending a message, we're just sending words. And especially in this day and age where I'll say people have become more passive with language, especially with virtual, it's even more important that we all sit around the table virtually and nod our head. And then we leave the room and say, oh, I think he meant this. And so we're not aligned in terms of how do we move to action. And so I think it's incredibly important to be precise and disciplined in our language to convey a single message to everybody involved.
That's great. And Joel, I know you've got some pet peeves here, and I know you're dying to tell us one. So what's your first pet peeve when it comes to vocabulary?
Let's start at the top of the P&L, revenue or sales or new orders.
Right.
Regardless, depending on who you're talking to in an organization, we all seem to forget that those have very different meanings. We act like we're at McDonald's ordering a hamburger, and we think an order is the same thing as a point of sale of revenue. In our project-based businesses, we have a new order from a customer that turns into a sale that we can execute. And it's only as we apply goods and resources to that sale can we then turn it into revenue. But when you've got your CFO busy talking about sale, pretending it's revenue, you really confuse your organization as to what are we talking about. And so having a clear distinction between new orders, sales, and revenues is critical for an organization to understand and begin to dialogue about the metric they're actually talking about. That's my pet peeve. I hate that one.
Well, and if I can
Bradley?
jump on that one, because
Yeah.
we often hear the sales manager tell his salespeople, go get more revenue. And it's like,
Right.
no, I need to be talking to ops. Go get me more revenue. So it's
exactly
that
right.
kind of language, Brad, that just, yeah.
Yeah, the one that drives me nuts is GP, gross profit, and GM, gross margin. Gross profit is dollars, it's money. And gross margin is a percentage, and they're different.
Yeah, I was just with a client and they were building out your tool and they were saying, well, we measure it based on gross margin. I'm like, oh, okay, percentage. And they're like, no, dollars. And I'm like, okay, well then why don't you put GP in that column? And they're like, no, that's not what we call it. And I'm like, okay, then you be good the way you are. So as long as everybody understands it poorly, I guess we're good.
And Bradley, you taught me a really important one, and that is scheduling versus assigning.
I remember that conversation.
Apologies.
Yeah, I took a lot of abuse on that one.
You did, and I appreciate that, and it's more, let's have the intellectual conversation to say, what does that really mean and how do we use it?
Right.
From a project perspective, there's cost and price and budget. And I'll have people say all the time to a PM, don't go over budget. And I'm like, well, over cost or over price? And they're like going over budget. And I'm like, well, which one? Is it the client's budget, which is the price? Or is it the integrator's budget, which is the cost? And then when you say don't go over it, are you saying don't do any change orders and just hide it all? So those three, and then you attach rate. Are we talking a cost of goods sold rate? Or are we talking a price to a customer? And again, it's just when I have all those words interchangeably with many people who weren't really formally educated when they entered a company as to what is our company's vocabulary, just send a lot of potentially mixed messages.
So true.
I want to jump on that one because price and cost internal to an operations organization can be really confusing. So if you're a purchasing agent and all day long you're talking to the vendor, then the vendor's always talking about the best price that you're getting. And you as the purchasing agent are thinking about the best price I'm getting. Next thing you know, they're sitting in an ops meeting talking about the price that they're getting and not realizing that in the integration business, the price, when I talk price, I'm talking about my sale price. I'm not talking about my cost. So their input A manufacturer's input of a price is my cost. But if I'm a purchasing person, sometimes I get trapped into talking the vendor's language instead of talking my customer's language, and it leads to a massive set of confusion. Imagine having your sales team convinced that they just got the sell price from the purchasing person when the purchasing person told them their cost basis.
So true. So who would like to tackle markup and margin?
Oh, we'll let you do that. I think that was one of your favorites.
Well, and this is especially true because sales always starts from the markup side because they start with manufacturer's costs. And a markup is when you take a cost and you apply a percentage to it and you end up with your selling price. Margin is what accountants talk about or business finance analysts, because they want to know when we did sell it, how much of that was profit. And that's also a percentage. And because they're both percentages, it can be confusing, but they're not equal. A 25% markup is not equal to a 25% margin. And there's a formula to get between them, which we can go over in another class. But what we have to remember is that if we have a 25% markup, that does not mean we have a 25% margin. The margin will be a smaller percentage than the 25% markup.
And it is amazing how people say, well, we know we're going to get that because we just multiplied it by 0.2, or 1.2.
Right.
I'm like, okay, back to the basics. But I think I'll say it's part of the company culture. Are we holding people responsible for their language? Because it just does have such an impact. And then you move to dashboards like your system has. And what does each word mean? And then how do we drive the movement of that lever? And if we don't understand what the word means, I don't know the cause and effect to pull that lever.
Well, I've really enjoyed this discussion. I know we're going to try and find a few more people and find out what their pet peeves are and hopefully add that to this podcast as well. But it's been a real pleasure today. Thank you as always. And we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Bradford.